Hello, friends. Lynn said that we like to talk about ourselves. If that's so, I suppose it's because we don't know who we are and we're trying to figure it out. This talk has gone through a lot of titles in its works this summer, and that's because it covers a lot of topics. It feels like I'm just pulling in every random idea that may be inspiring. That might be the case. It's about exuberance, although I don't include that word in the title any longer. I spent a bit of time depressed this summer, and so I really was just sort of pulling in all of the ideas that I thought could help me through it in some way. But that's just to say this is a personal study as well as an academic study, and I hope you'll enjoy. There are, in certain of Chesterton's works of fiction, characters which make seemingly possible a blaze of life that I find intrinsically captivating. There is a subtle but constant quality of expectancy, of delight, of revelry, and the possibility of decision and action in characters like Douglas Murrell in The Return of Don Quixote, Patrick Dalleroy in The Flying Inn, Innocent Smith in Man Alive, Gabriel Syme in The Man Who Was Thursday, or Adam Wayne in The Napoleon of Notting Hill. I say subtle because of the difficulty of representing this quality of life by sampling any particular passage from any one of these books, but subtle is not quite right because of the sense of vitality of each one of these characters is overwhelming. To me, in their particularities, but especially in their commonalities, these characters give outline and vivid detail to what might be contained in that vast and elusive promise of life more abundantly. In The Return of Don Quixote, Douglas Murrell goes to the shopping center at the request of a lady in search of a more vivid line of pigments that has long been discontinued. He is gone for weeks and turns the search for paints into a personal battle against all the impersonal forces of society that drive the small shopkeeper and artisan out of business and replace his products with a world made universally of plastic. In The Flying Inn, Patrick Dalleroy capers around England with an immense wheel of cheese and a barrel of rum and an inn sign eluding a hygienic, scientific, and Islamic regulatory authoritarianism and prohibition, all the while extemporizing songs satirizing things like progress, eugenics, and industrialism. Innocent Smith, in Man Alive, absorbs himself for hours at his own trial, improvising with origami. He chases his own hat, and others' hats for them, with more energy and emotion than most men chase careers, or even women. His life is one long, elaborate object lesson, the moral of which seems to be the possibility of being happy. In the more fantastical elements of his biography, he scours the earth in search of his own home, and in more mundane moments breaks into his own house, steals his own food, and elopes with his own wife. Everyone else's hobbies and proclivities become more colorful around Smith too, because of his profound enjoyment of them along with their authors. Around him, everyone becomes interested again in their own lives and fall in love again with each other. His complete appreciation of the thing in front of him both literally opens doors no one else can see and turns the normality of the commonest household routines into the drama of festivity and institution. An excellent shot, Innocent Smith takes upon himself the risky and disreputable task of shooting at pessimists and nihilists, putting bullet holes in their hats and coats and things in an attempt to shock them awake and give them another chance at enjoying the life they've had with them all along. Most of the details of Innocent's colorful and unconventional life we find when he is on trial for an attempted murder after placing a few holes in a psychologist's top hat from a few feet away in the garden at Beacon House. Near the end of his trial, Michael Moon, Innocent's defending attorney, sums up this man's character by saying, "This man's spiritual power has been precisely this, that he has distinguished between custom and creed. He has broken the conventions, but he has kept the commandments. If he can defy conventions, it is because he can keep commandments." Indeed, a little later on, Michael Moon, of dubious reputation himself, puts the reason for Smith's extraordinary happiness almost in the aphorism, "He is so very happy because he is so very good." Such a formulation may well seem hopelessly dissatisfying, as if we should expect hilariousness to result from doing our chores, or an ecstasy to be the natural outcome of performing perfectly some colossal rulebook. I think such a formulation should be dissatisfying, depending on our conception of the good. Part of the problem of accepting being good, as the necessary and sufficient cause of being exuberant, is the difference between moral principles and purity codes. Society, the great social beast, has endless methods of organizing itself, and these boil down fundamentally to purity codes, or conventions of role and belonging. These conventions have near limitless value in terms of survival, but not necessarily any relation to moral value. The difficulty of doing something well like church is precisely because a church is an attempt to be both the social apparatus, I won't say beast, and the organization and of organization dependent upon purity codes, and the body of goodness, beauty, and truth, making available the eternal to the temporal. Societal purity codes may overlap or reinstate moral principles, or they might have nothing to do with them. To accept the source of Innocent Smith's exuberance, then, we will have to at least draw the distinction that Michael does initially between conventions and commandments. To put it another way, Innocent Smith, along with to some extent his peers in the other novels, is someone entirely unconventional in regard to all the conventions that restrict and cripple the human spirit, and someone fiercely conventional in regard to all the conventions that enhance the human spirit's virtue and vitality. This is the best that I can do with the question with the material we have so far, but I'll return to this question of what we take the good to be later in my lecture, where we'll read Chesterton's protagonists through Martin Buber's concept of the secret betrothal between fate and freedom, in an attempt to thicken our concept of the good. Attempting to further understand the exuberance of the characters in Chesterton's fiction, I turned to his autobiography to discover whether there were biographical hints as to the necessary and sufficient conditions for vitality. There are such hints, as when his dad and uncles are criticizing the common book of prayers, prayer of general thanksgiving, since a good many people have very little reason to be thankful for their creation, and his grandfather said, I should thank God for my creation, even if I knew I were a lost soul. Later, in a personal revolt against the lunacy and despair of his own solipsism, where he concluded, mere existence reduced to its primary limits was extraordinary enough to be exciting. So later in the biography, in a revolt against the personal lunacy and despair of solipsism, Chesterton concludes that mere existence, reduced to its most primary limits, was extraordinary enough to be exciting. Anything was magnificent as compared to nothingness. Even if the very daylight were a dream, it was a daydream, not a nightmare. The mere fact that one could wave one's arms and legs about showed that it had not the paralysis of a nightmare, or if it was a nightmare, it was an enjoyable nightmare. He said that he hung to the remains of religion by one thin thread of thanks, thanking whatever gods there might be. Interestingly to me, Chesterton credited Walt Whitman, that raucous and robust praisemaker, with assisting this transformation in his outlook. Chesterton's sense of the extraordinariness of existence is probably best put in this quote from his book on Chaucer, where he says, "There is at the back of all our lives an abyss of light, more blinding and unfathomable than any abyss of darkness. It is the abyss of actuality, of existence, of the fact that things truly are, and that we ourselves are incredibly and sometimes almost incredulously real." It is one thing to be able to conceptualize this abyss of light. It is another thing to actually feel its brightness. And even if one has felt its brightness, it's still another thing altogether to persistently live in its light. Another place in his autobiography, Chesterton puts the problem like this. The real difficulty of man is not to enjoy lampposts or landscapes, not to enjoy dandelions or chops, but to enjoy enjoyment, to keep the capacity of really liking what he likes. That is the practical problem which the philosopher has to solve. I propose that in and through the characters in the 5 novels we have here to consider, Chesterton is attempting to solve this problem. I think that in each in his own way, the characters we are considering from these novels is a portrait of someone enormously, endlessly capable of enjoyment. In Douglas Murrell or Patrick Dalroy, we get the sense of someone so experienced that they are done with experience and have elected instead to become naive. Someone wiser than a serpent, but more harmless than a dove. Adam Wayne or Gabriel Syme, both incidentally poets, are men so completely given over to a cause and ready to die for it that they can revel in every other aspect of life as incidental, as merely surplus. Innocent Smith is either a bigamist, a homebreaker, an attempted murderer, or else someone who has married his wife a dozen times, entered his home in a dozen ways, and shot very neatly around a dozen pessimists. That is to say, innocent. Chesterton fills you with affection and admiration towards his characters, such as you may have felt when you were very small, towards those heroes of adolescence throwing themselves energetically into the torrential river of adulthood. The adults of your childhood may well have been as dull and inscrutable as the inhabitants of Beacon House in Man Alive before Innocent Smith came to lodge there, but those daring youths poised to leap from childhood into that adulthood were always able to inspire awe. This is the attraction of Gabriel Smith or Patrick Dalroy, someone who is not so very different than ourselves, but someone who, unlike us, is possessed not by monotonous durations of unmeaning time, but by kairos, the perfect moment of inspiration. It is only the few who are able to aspire to the virtues and qualities of the gods when they live on Mount Olympus and we in the second world, but we are all able to aspire when our heroes become human. As we are only able to imitate divinity when divinity becomes human, or as we are only capable of seeing the Father when he is shown to us in the Son. When an ideal is in some finite way beyond us, we are able to admire and aspire to be like it, while we are unable to aspire or even to admire an ideal which is infinitely beyond us. This is the limit, perhaps, of something I will call the approachability of the good. For something to be desirable, it must, in some sense, be close to us already. This is the case with the kingdom of heaven, for we are told it is near. Perhaps it is just around the corner. The child who wants the simplicity and adventure of the autonomy of adulthood can't know that simplicity and adventure, and therefore couldn't desire it, unless there were some through line of that simplicity and adventure running in both its non-adult condition and the condition of being an adult. The condition of attaining desire must somehow already be present in the self, for the self to consider the desired condition as desirable. And so, desire is the representative of the other within me. It's the ambassador of the not-self already within the self. There's a theme that runs through Chesterton and his characters in these novels of the approachability of the good, that what's most valuable is actually what's most common, that what's most desirable is actually what's close at hand, a sort of patriotism of the small. In Napoleon of Notting Hill, we are told that the patriot boasts in the smallness of his country, not its largeness. A child will be more proud to be king of a paving stone that his feet can barely fit inside than the whole garden he can rush about in. A man will care more to defend his nation if it is small and under attack than if it is proud and impregnable. We give our loyalties not when the object of our loyalty is invulnerable, but when the object of loyalty is vulnerable and our loyalty matters to it. According to this insight, we love, or the things we love, are lovable because they are finite, local, and exhaustible, not because they are infinite, universal, and inexhaustible. In a similar reversal, we are later told, "In the darkest of the books of God there is written a truth that is also a riddle. It is of the new things that men tire, of fashions, proposals, improvements, and change. It is the old things that startle and intoxicate. It is the old things that are young. There is no skeptic who does not feel that many have doubted before. There is no rich and fickle man who does not feel that all his novelties are ancient. There is no worshiper of change who does not feel upon his neck the vast weight of the weariness of the universe. But we who do the old things are fed by nature with a perpetual infancy. No man who is in love thinks that anyone has been in love before. No woman who has a child thinks that there has ever been such a thing as children. The world is always the same because it is always unexpected." For Chesterton and his protagonists, things are lovable not when they're new and large, but when they are little and old. When they are comprehensible in the sense that you can get your head around them. He is half right because you can only desire that which you can in some way apprehend, but he's half wrong because you cannot stay interested in what you can wholly comprehend. That is, for something to remain lovable to a person, it must be small enough to get into his head and large enough to expand his head once it's there. It must be old enough for him to recognize, but new enough to require recognition. For knowledge to be love, it must convey both the knowability and the unknowability of the beloved. The way that love knows its object is simultaneously by knowing something of it and by knowing that there is something of it which its love does not know. Whatever else it may be, idolatry is always not allowing the unknown into what we worship. I had the privilege of spending a day this summer in the company of my 3-year-old niece. I think she might be 4. 3 or 4, it's give or take. I am sure that there are moments in which being a 3-year-old is difficult, but I'm equally certain that for these difficulties, a 3-year-old is more than compensated by the sheer joy that erupts from everything else they bump into. I'm sure that there are accidents of time and history that permit her exquisite species of joy, and I'm sure there are endless thoughts and labors and prayers on the part of my brother and sister-in-law that made possible their daughter's reckless happiness. But I'm also sure that there's an aspect of her happiness for which no one is responsible except herself and God. That is to say, it is made possible by her condition of being a child. Because they are relatively empty, that is, not yet full of themselves, very small children drink in reality in a steady stream, as if from a fire hose. As we become older, we are presented increasingly with the opportunity of operating in some heuristic that allows us to interact with reality productively, deriving some good from it for ourselves or for those near us, which effectively amounts to some benefit to ourselves. This process is necessary and even good, for it permits the organism to become self-sustaining rather than remaining reliant on its caregivers. But it is often disastrous, for in relating to life as a field from which to draw productivity, you can lose the ability to relate to it in any other way. This is how you lose your humanity. You can literally lose the ability to see or to respond except in terms of instrumentality. What permits the perpetual infancy of really being delighted by the thing in front of you? What is it that provides the freedom of really enjoying what you enjoy? How reliable can we take Adam Wayne's answer that nature supplies a perpetual infancy to those who are doing the old things? What does it mean again? What does it mean to become again as little children? I think that taking one moral trait that we sometimes witness in children, and such as the readiness to forgive or anything else that you could throw in there, is not becoming again as little children. I think that what we should be looking for is an entire mode of or orientation towards the world, a posture of the soul, a total way of orientation towards ourselves and towards the world. I'm going to try to understand that orientation through the word eros. Eros is the force that pulls you into love. The love that it pulls you into may be the romantic and sexual love between partners biologically compatible for reproduction of offspring. But classically, this is not the only type of love where eros is at work. I want us to think of eros also as the force that pulls us into every other kind of love, towards love of every other kind of thing. And suggest that if we don't have a sense of the draw of love towards writing, planting, harvesting, nature, shared meals, or any other number of things, we probably have an impoverished notion of love. Eros, in the sense of attraction to sexual and romantic love, may be the most powerful expression of eros, but it is not the only expression of eros. It is the most powerful because here it is at its most condensed, in its most condensed form, as a force operating again upon its own force, as if the desire towards life were multiplied again by the desire towards life. In the sense of sex, eros is the regenerative center that refreshes the human spirit by generating new beings, and so continuing the supply of intelligences which have not yet had time to become full of themselves, to become weary. Closer to the source of life than we who have grown old, children slip more easily, more by default, into the grace of enjoyment, of appreciating whatever is in front of them simply because it is. I think eros in our language came to be restricted to sex by a process of metonymy, whereby the concept came to be defined only by its most condensed form. I think it's helpful, though, to have a term to describe the pull common to all manner of desirable things that draws us out of ourselves and into participation with the world. The space between desire and fulfillment, I think, is this eros. The path between anticipation and participation that includes both. Someone under the influence, responding to eros, or inspired by the God of love, is living unselfconsciously in the erotic gap between one state of being and another, and so actively being created and participating in the process of recreation. For every time we are caught up in love, the world is made something different, something new as a result. You can take the example of any activity that you desire and pursue as a way that the world is different, is remade across that path of anticipation and participation. In this broadened sense of eros, I suggest that becoming again as a little child means taking on an erotic posture towards the world. A way of being that is characterized as absorbing life itself, taking it into you, consuming it, becoming one with it. To become a child, again, is to become one enchanted with life. As in a fit of infatuation, one is enchanted by their lover. Not navigating life with cunning and calculation, but drinking it in with ecstasy. You are thinking of yourself rightly when you are drinking in life. That is to say, not thinking of yourself, but simply enjoying. This is not something that we can think our way into, but it may be something that we can thank our way into. Every time you become aware of yourself, rejoice. Direct your attention away from where it made contact with its own self and disperse it instead into exaltation. The only place where it will be gathered up again and preserved for you. Gratitude is taking your attention off of yourself. There is a humility involved with all expressions of eros. That is the core, I think, of our Lord saying, that is at the core, I think, of our Lord saying, except you become again as little children. Humility is not being aware of yourself as inferior, but not being aware of yourself at all by virtue of being more aware of something or someone else. The humility of the lover is a reverencing of the beloved as being more worthy of attending to than himself. The child drinking life in is living in the humility of being taken up by something that is not himself. The exuberance of Gabriel Syme in The Man Who Was Thursday, or Adam Wayne in A Point of Notting Hill, is more terrible and more fascinating than that of Douglas Murrell or Innocent Smith, because it arises not from a drab ordinariness and conventionality of the lives around him, but instead, like Patrick Dalroy's desperate vitality in the face of the British occupation of Ireland, the lost Greek wars against the Turks, and a futuristic British prohibition and authoritarianism, their vitality and exuberance arises in response to wild and intolerable circumstances far outside of their control. Adam Wayne, a serious and poetic soul, takes the satirical return to medieval pageantry fostered by a decadent and absurdist monarch seriously and poetically, and gives the whole huge naivete of his heart to the chivalrous and melodramatic local patriotism that everyone else just puts up with as a sort of official nuisance, or laughs at as a societally large practical joke, or a vast installment of the theater of the absurd. As a consequence of his love for his obscure little neighborhood in London and his belief in its right to exist, Adam Wayne defends Notting Hill against armies of developers, progressives, investors, and construction workers intent on leveling it to carry through a section of a highway. After the battles and blood, we witness a surrealist conversation between two interlocutors that are not named, but whom we can only assume to be the king and Adam Wayne. The king asks Adam, suppose the whole matter were really just hocus pocus. Suppose that whatever meaning you may choose in your fancy to give it, the real meaning of the whole was mockery. Suppose it was folly. Suppose I've been in it, answered the voice from the tall and strange figure, and I know it was not. Suppose I am God, said the voice, and suppose that I made the world in idleness. Suppose that the stars that you think eternal are only the idiot fireworks of an everlasting schoolboy. Suppose the sun and moon to which you sing alternately are only the two eyes of one vast and sneering giant, opened alternately in a never-ending wink. Suppose the trees in my eyes are as foolish as enormous toadstools. Suppose Socrates and Charlemagne are to me only beasts, made funnier by walking on their hind legs. Suppose I am God, and having made things, I laugh at them. And suppose I am man, answered the other, and suppose that I give the answer that shatters even a laugh. Suppose I do not laugh back at you, do not blaspheme you, do not curse you, but suppose, standing up straight under the sky with every power of my being, I thank you for the fool's paradise you have made. Suppose I praise you with the literal pain of ecstasy for the jest that has brought me so terrible a joy. If we have taken the child's games and given them the seriousness of a crusade, if we have drenched your grotesque Dutch garden with the blood of martyrs, if we have turned a nursery into a temple, I ask you, in the name of heaven, who wins? The same dark question lies at the heart of The Man Who Was Thursday. Are we such that we could love life in reality, even if it were a joke, even if its meaning, its urgency was totally other than we take it to be? We can argue whether The Man Who Was Thursday is a dream, an allegory, or a farce, but the dark question at its heart is all the darker for all the silly policemen thinking they are wrapped up in the greatest conspiracy and crisis of their age, and discovering that they are only spying on each other and chasing an eccentrical gentleman around England with far too much money, vitality, and imagination on his hands around England. laboring under a vast illusion and attempting to destroy the huge evil that has taken over their imaginations, these men turn the whole French Catholic countryside against each other in their attempt to destroy this evil. And for a dark hour, it appears that the whole world has gone mad. Each one of these inspectors, who has flung himself fanatically into the fight against nihilism and anarchy, received his charge from a man in a dark room with his back towards the recruit, whose face he never saw. And so, time and time again in their encounter time and time again, this encounter in the dark and its meaning are called into question by the characters as they desperately try to navigate the spectacular horrors and absurdities of the plot. The quality of those meetings in the dark and the extent to which they were tested is best described by the voice of Sunday in a passage near the end of the book. I sat in darkness where there is no created thing. And to you I was only a voice commanding valor and unnatural virtue. You heard the voice in the dark, and you never heard it again. The sun in heaven denied it. The earth and sky denied it. All of human wisdom denied it. And when I met you in the daylight, I denied it myself. There's a natural ascendancy to the problem of how to enjoy things as they are between man alive and the man who is Thursday. In Man Alive, the question is mostly how to enjoy things when life is ordinary and of a matter of course and apparently very much under your control. In The Man Who is Thursday, the question becomes how to enjoy things as they are when they are truly, to all appearances, terrible. How do you revel in the givenness of reality when the ground reels under your feet, when the sky is inscrutable above you and you have very little control over what is happening to you? How do you enjoy your experiences for themselves when their meaning is totally other than what you took them to be? What does it mean to enjoy experience for its own sake when you have no way of understanding what it is? This is not possible, I don't think, without the virtue of hope, which is the avoidance of either of the twin sins of presumption or despair. Triumphalism is not hope. I suspect that our pronouncements on the afterlife and the restoration of all things and ultimate reconciliation often fall into presumption of assuming that we now already have the necessary comportment to know what we are talking about. Despair equally is a sin against hope, for it is also a conclusion, a sort of negative assumption about what things are and what they will be. Hope, I think, is something like dynamic expectancy, a living expectancy that evolves in real time to the good as it reveals itself to be. Dynamic expectancy is co-created between an imagination and desire for the good and the real environment, and is dependent upon constitutively related to both. It is a static expectancy that cripples and disappoints. A living hope, we're looking for a living hope, a dynamic expectancy. This living hope, a dynamic expectancy, is resilient and vital enough to adapt its conception of the good to include any circumstance in which it finds itself part. This is how hope is related to vitality and vitality to exuberance. Vitality is capable of reveling in what is. Insipidity requires an alteration of what is before it can agree to be happy. The person of vitality recognizes and revels in the good of things as they are without demanding that they be more than they are or resenting that they are no longer what they were. In one of the great rhetorical moments of Napoleon of Notting Hill, Adam Wayne shouts down at his enemies, "As the tree falleth, so shall it lie." Men have called this a gloomy text. It is the essence of all exaltation. He means it is possible to rejoice at everything that it is exactly what it is, as if it were a gift, as if it were the result of will, not only of absurdity and chaos. Clinging to the branch of a tree to keep from collapsing under his wounds, he goes on thundering, I am doing now what I have done all my life. What is the only happiness? What is the only universality? I am clinging to something. I am doing what the truly wise do. When a child goes into the garden and takes hold of a tree saying, let this tree be all I have, I tell you at that moment its roots take hold on hell and its branches on the stars. You shouldn't take this last bit to be metaphysically true, but you can take it to be mystically true or even experientially true. When your heart establishes the frame of attention, be it only one person, one tree, one conversation, your horizon of significance shrinks down to fill that frame and turns it from microcosm into cosmos. You cannot love something, a tree, a person, or a conversation without recognizing that it exceeds your ability to grasp it. In loving something, you turn it for yourself into cosmos. That is, something that exists for itself, wholly other, outside of, set apart from yourself. In loving something, you see it rightly. In seeing it rightly, you recognize that it does not exist for you. Its ultimate orientation is not even towards you. In a moment of sublime inspiration, Gabriel Syme shouts to the other members of the Council of the Days, shall I tell you the secret of the whole world? It is that we have only known the back of the world. We have seen everything from behind, and it looks brutal. That is not a tree, but the back of a tree. That is not a cloud, but the back of a cloud. Cannot you see that everything is stooping and hiding a face? If only we could get round front. We could think of the suggestion here as being, if we see the back of the world, it is because it has its face turned towards God. This seems beautiful, and indeed is a beautiful thought. But the lived experience of the congregations of reality all standing around with their backs to each other is pretty lonely. Syme goes on saying, I see everything that there is. Why does each thing on earth war against each other? Why does each small thing in the world have to fight against the world itself? Why does a fly have to fight the whole universe? Why does a dandelion have to fight the whole universe? For the same reason that I had to be alone on the dreadful council of days, so that each thing that obeys law may have the glory and the isolation of the anarchist, so that each man fighting for order may be as brave and good a man as the dynamiter, so that the lie of Satan may be flung back in the face of this blasphemer, so that by tears and torture we may earn the right to say to this man, you lie. No agonies can be too great to buy the right to say to this accuser, we also have suffered. There's a kind of consciousness that we have as persons necessitates the awareness of its separation, or the lonely burden of individuality. Any entity or impulse within the universe that discovers itself, and by discovering itself, discovers also its separation from all else, and discovers to that extent that it is alone. And upon discovering that it is alone, it encounters the two-stage temptation of despairing at the revelation of its aloneness, and much more diabolically doubling down on that position of solitude and glorying in the situation of being set apart, set against, and apart from all else that is. This is the position of the accuser, that having set itself apart, would desire to set apart also every other thing from all other things also. There are several alternatives to the accuser, or the diabolical pride of glorying in the self's separation. The first is to accept that you are something, separated from all else that is, and then go on to, as far as possible, forget yourself in its separation, in the exercise of carrying back and forth between yourself and the world the good, the meaning, the reality, that are common to both. This is the manner of a child, of one who has not yet remembered his division from the continuous unconscious procession of the universe. There is very much a negative aspect to remembering that is almost always overlooked. For something to be remembered, it must have already been dismembered, and therefore does not connote a real unity, but instead an assemblage. The child, when he is very young, does not have or need memory, for he is very much still all at one place, not distributed across an embodied past and a projected future, fragmented into many experiences and desires. The second alternative to the accuser is to attend deeply to the ways that you are not separated from all else that exists. There is a reality to your isolation as a self from all else that exists, but that isolation is not total but that isolation is only total in your self-consciousness, your meta-awareness. This isolation is perhaps most felt in certain kinds of suffering, particularly the affliction of the mind, turning as witness upon its own suffering. The separation of individuality is not complete in your consciousness or in your body, though reflected there decreasingly from consciousness to body. Consciousness is both of the self and of the other. It is co-created between them and constitutive of both. Thought is receptive and consumptive of the other. In thought, the self is both hosting and posing the object of thought, which is guest. Much more so than consciousness, the body, though apparently discrete, is deeply interwoven with the rest of reality. Subject to all the same forces as the rest of material reality, it is moved and changed and held together at every level of causal reality, from quantum to gravitational. Though we, in the sense of our self-reflective and self-directive capacities, are set apart from the whole rest of the creation in our own microcosm of limited sovereignty, we are also, in the sense of our bodies, joined to the whole of creation and intimately, inextricably woven together with it. From this perspective, there is a way in which our bodies are younger, fresher, and closer to God than our conscious and self-conscious capacities. For the very matter from which our bodies take their form is in total reliance, total surrender, total obedience to Him. Attending to your embodied experience, then, at its every layer, including where it dwindles away from consciousness to matter, attending to the elegance of its systems and functions, attending to the way that your body fits into its environment, are ways of moving out of the solipsism of isolation and back into the connectedness of all things. This is the posture of the contemplative. This type of attending is certainly not always easy or always peaceful. As Annie Dillard writes, in the depths are the violence and terror of which psychology has warned us. But if you ride these monsters deeper down, if you drop with them farther over the world's rim, you find what our sciences cannot locate or name: the substrate, the ocean or matrix or ether that buoys the rest, which gives goodness its power for good, evil its power for evil, the unified field, our complex and inexplicable caring for each other, for our life here. A third alternative to the angry isolation of the accuser is to accept your separation and individuality and work from it with all of your effort towards your best vision of the unification of all things. This is the posture of the peasant, of the poet, of the priest, working towards at-one-ment. Here there is a participation, a co-laboring between the lowliest farmer digging in the earth and Christ's final work on the cross. Though one seems to be entirely natural and the other entirely supernatural, both are laboring to recreate the world. Simone Weil writes, manual labor is time entering into the body. Through work, man turns himself into matter, as Christ does in the Eucharist. Work is like death. We have to pass through death. We have to be killed to endure the weight of the world. When the universe is weighing on the back of the human creature, what is there to be surprised if it hurts him? Work is like a death if it is without incentive. We have to act, renouncing the fruits of action. To work, if we are worn out, it means that we're becoming as submissive to time as matter is. Thought is forced to pass from one instant to the next without laying hold of the past or the future. This is what it means to obey. There is a solitude inescapable to human experience. Comforts and consolations assuage it, but they can also be treacherous because it is difficult to know whether they are providing answers or only distractions from the question. In the end, in the sense of accountability, we are always alone with the voice of God, accountable to what we have heard, though we do not always hear it. The voice of God speaks to us plainly, though as it were in a dark room. We know we have heard something, but we cannot see the person who has spoken. We know we have received something through our noetic sense, but we cannot verify its content or origin with any of our other senses. In his address, there is usually no room for dialogue, no space for reassurance or second guessing or coming around again to the point. The voice of God speaks to us at some point in our past, through our parents, through the sacred texts, through a vision of what is possible, and then may well become silent and stay silent through the long-lived days of our actual contact with time, with conflict, and with suffering. As Heschel writes, faith is mostly being faithful to a time when we had faith. The voice of God, the voice in the dark room, the voice of Sunday, draws us into a moral drama, the stakes of which seem to be our very souls. And we suffer all the seriousness of society, ambition, sex, anxiety, self-denial, certain of forces that are beyond our control, and certain of our requirement to somehow respond to them honorably. Gabriel Syme and Adam Wayne choose their fate in real time as it is revealed to them and love the conditions that result from forces that are beyond their control. Martin Buber may well have been describing someone like Adam Wayne or Gabriel Syme when he wrote in I and Thou, the man to whom freedom is assured does not feel oppressed by causality. You think of causality basically as the causal flow of events, the mechanistic layer of reality, everything bumping into everything else that could appear as if it's totally determined, that gives all appearance of being completely determined. But the man to whom his freedom is assured does not feel oppressed by the unstoppable, impersonal cataract of causality. I want to explicate the next paragraph, the next passage in Martin Buber in I and Thou, following that quote. So I would love to put it in front of you so that you can receive it in more than just your noetic senses, hopefully through your hearing and sight as well. Here we go. Could you make this work, dear?
I'll try.
Thank you. We're going to read this paragraph first and then go into an explication of it, and that will conclude my lecture. Buber writes, fate and freedom are promised to each other. Fate is encountered only by him that actualizes his freedom, that I discovered the deed that intends me, that this movement of my freedom reveals the mystery to me, but this too, that I cannot accomplish it in the way that I intended it, This resistance also reveals the mystery to me. He that forgets all being caused, thank you, Darren. He that forgets all being caused, as he decides from the depths, he that puts aside his possessions and cloak and steps bare before the countenance. This free human being encounters fate as the counter image of his freedom. It is not his limit, but his completion. Freedom and fate embrace each other to form meaning, and given meaning, fate, with its eyes hitherto severe, suddenly full of light, looks like grace itself. I'm going to take this sentence by sentence and try to illuminate it for us. Fate and freedom are promised to each other. Already there's an insinuation of relationship, of something personal about the reality behind the language of our abstractions. The rationally irreconcilable polarities of one of our most terrible paradoxes are in fact betrothed to each other, as if two who had appeared arch enemies were in a secret, unconcluded love affair. Fate is encountered only by him that actualizes his freedom. It is not by a heroic act that you can escape your fate, but only by heroic action that you will discover what your fate may be. If what is meant by providence and predestination is the will of a God who is love, then escaping your fate is the only real tragedy. That I discovered the deed that intends me, that this movement of my freedom reveals the mystery to me. It is the movement of freedom that discovers the channel, the riverbed of determination. Fragments of personality are again sewn into the impersonal forces of reality. Causality itself is interested in you. It is thinking of you. Fate intends to ask you a question. In the language of Old English courtship, you are its intended. She used a personal pronoun there. You are his intended. But this too, that I cannot accomplish it in the way that I intended it, this resistance also reveals the mystery to me. We could not have started without freedom, without our own choice and will. But we reach a point where our will is no longer self-contained. Our desire is no longer discrete, but instead adapting itself to the desirable. He that forgets all being caused, as he decides from the depths, he that puts aside possessions and cloak and steps bare before the countenance, this human being encounters fate as the counter-image of his freedom. The myriad circumstances of causality, the 10,000 things, disappear in the moment of clarity, of agency, of choice. And the self that from time to time oppressed by the 10,000 things of anxiety and so degraded to an it becomes a you. The subject of time and affliction and causality passes reverently once again into the household of personhood. The 10,000 things become for him transparent. Possessions and circumstances have no purchase on him because the pearl of great price has put its purchase on him, and he would purchase, without any further knowledge, deliberation, or control, the whole field it is found in. The whole force field that it is found in. Again, there are elements of personhood, the hint of a face in the vast, unstoppable disclosure of reality. It is not his limit, but his completion. Fate and freedom embrace each other to form meaning. And given meaning, fate, with its eyes hitherto severe, suddenly full of light, looks like grace itself. Fate is not the opposite, limitation or inhibitor of your freedom. But and I mean by fate, what has happened, what is unavoidable. And everything will at some point be fate. Fate is not the opposite, the limitation or the inhibitor of your freedom, but the environment towards which your freedom is in a constitutive relationship. The chaos-like sea of necessity and contingency provides the volume and density the necessary volume and density permitting the swimmer of freedom to stay afloat. A counterimage is not an inverse. A counterimage is an inverse, not a negation. As the perimeter around your face, though not being your face, resembles your face perfectly and permits, not negates, its existence. Your desire, brought out into the world, actualized by your choice, is transfigured by the desirable as it reveals itself to be, and becomes other in its fulfillment than it was in its conception. In embracing freedom and fate, conform to each other. Meaning is a meeting of desire and fulfillment on the pathway of disclosure. The inexorable flow of time, the ubiquitous insistence and interference of matter that form the apparatus of causality, when loved for being near, for permitting the face by not being it, take on the loveliness and the familiarity of a face. What had appeared oppressive and intolerable becomes grace itself, that which is always only given, never earned, the very ground that permits possibility and actuality, and gathers up the fragmentary and the partial back into meaning. Freedom and fate embrace when the best that is within the self and the best that is within all that is not self are brought forth in response to each other. The crucible of the man who is Thursday, the terrible question, can ye drink of the cup which I drink, the cross itself, all imply that the circumstances of this meeting of the best that is within you and the best that is within reality, may well be as hideous as they be sublime. The countenance that one puts aside possessions and cloak and steps bare before is the countenance of all that is best within that which is not oneself. And you can only hope to bear this countenance by bringing forth all that is best within you. Your fate is something which must be wooed. You must convince it to come to you, not by arguments and casuistry, but by an honorability in your every action and decision. This is part of what I think Martin Shaw means. This is part of what I think it means is meant when Martin Shaw says, there is something out there trying to get your attention. In response to it, you must learn the business of becoming a praisemaker. You must not come before your fate wearing anything that is dishonorable, or come wearing anything that is dishonorable even before the sea of causality. You must learn to speak so that even that which is without ears will come to love the sound of your voice. If you would be free, the fate that intends you, you must come to love. The gift of idealization in common romance is very much that it reveals to you someone in the best possible light. But very much more that it compels you to reveal the best possible version of yourself. In loving someone, you are given the reason and cause to bring forth the best that is within you. To woo the beloved, you do your best to ensure that your every response to them is honorable. To woo your fate, to actualize your freedom, you must also ensure that your every response to the mechanistic, oceanic expanse of cause and effect is honorable, though it still appear to you as absurdity and chaos, though it does not yet have any of the characteristics of a face. To receive your fate, to hear your sentence, you must stand before the judge and sing to him, as if there were a judge, as if he had a face. Somewhere in Man Is Not Alone, Abraham Joshua Heschel writes, religion begins where experience ends, and the end of experience is a perception of our being perceived.